My name's Dan Vickers. Many of you know me through my lovely fiance, Dr. Rachel Barkley. I initially heard about this information because Rachel came to me one day asking if I knew anything about a function called the Fourier transform. And little did she know that that's basically all I do at work every day for the last 3 years. So my background is as a computational physicist, and currently I primarily work in radar physics for MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And in particular, I've taken an interest in digital signal processing, which is taking discrete, digitally measured signals and trying to extract information out of them that is useful to operators of whatever kind of technology measured it. So while the radar technology that I typically work on is very different from EEG, a lot of the math is the same, and I was able to provide a lot of mathematical analysis on this topic. I am legally required to tell you that none of this work was done funded on military work. It's just part of what I have to do for work as a disclaimer. So yeah, with that being said, we can move on. When I got a call from Dr. Ortega about 2 days ago, who told me that we probably would be focusing on questions. So I have about 60 slides here that are really made to be like supplemental materials for questions. So feel free to interrupt me as you ask. As Dr. Ortega said, he wanted me to do jazz up here and be flexible. So without further ado, does anyone have leading questions immediately about any of the content of the video before we get started going through some slides? No, fantastic. So I really hope this is forward. It is. I thought a little bit of background on EEG processing might be useful for everyone here. Many of you may not know that this technology is actually just barely over 100 years old. So a German researcher, Hansberger, first invented the EEG for human use. And that's how long we've been using EEG technology. This is not particularly new. And in 1937 is the first date that it was noted the effects of anesthetic drugs on patient EEGs. So this is how long we've had this relation. And particularly it was in the 90s when we started extracting individual values and information from the EEG that might be useful in the clinical setting. The big change, there we go. The big change going on now is clinicians now have access to this technology directly in the OR. So that's a more recent change that's coming. All of the work in this talk is based on data collected from the Masimo SedLine, but the BIS monitor is also a very common one that's used. And these displays provide a lot of really powerful information to you guys who are the direct operators of these machines. But of course, there's a minimum required understanding to actually make full use of the information here. And so the challenges are that you now have to split your attention between these machines and all the other stuff that you guys are trained on as anesthesiologists, and trying to extract relevant patient information. There are some values like the PSI, the patient spectral index, that's plotted on the machine that are useful. They're not always 100% reliable, especially with certain types of drugs that we might get to later. But while this is a useful simplifying tool, it doesn't capture the full image. So the goals of this talk is to try and build a visual understanding about exactly what this data is meant to represent, and help you kind of understand intuitively how certain patterns that are showing up on the display are related to the patient biology. So yeah, with that, I want to talk a little bit about constructing the DSA. As Dr. Ortega said, I'm trying to avoid math. I promise there's exactly 2 equations in this entire talk, but this one is really, really important. So as mentioned in the video before, you can get some kind of composing signal. This top left image, the blue signal, is some random collection of harmonic signals I just added together on a computer. And then I extracted the amplitudes of those composing frequencies back out. So every signal that we measure, it can be mathematically proven, is exactly a combination of some subset of frequencies of signals. Anything can be represented like this. This is a form of mathematics called Fourier analysis. And the most important equation in Fourier analysis is probably the Fourier transform. Might be the most important equation ever. We use this technology in our cell phones for communications, in radar, in EEG processing, and many, many other things. And particularly what the Fourier transform does is it takes time domain data. So if you measure your signal as a function of time, you can say, oh, wow, it gets bigger here, and then it gets smaller. It goes negative. The amplitude shifted a little bit. That's time series data. And the Fourier transform allows us to separate the time information and only look at it as a function of frequency. We call this frequency domain data. And you can generate a frequency spectrum, which is shown on the bottom plot here. So the frequency spectrum is a function of frequency being on the x-axis. And now the relative amplitude of the signals is plotted on the y-axis. So this actually has all the same information. You can prove that if you have one signal, you can perfectly extract the other signal. But it's often easier to immediately gather information from the Fourier transform. And just to give you a little bit of a visual representation, I have a few examples. So for example, this is a 1 Hertz sine wave that I have plotted on the left. And if you take the Fourier transform of it on the right, you'll notice that it's 0 everywhere except for a single spike that shows up at 1 Hertz. So from this plot on the right, I know, oh, there's exactly one signal present, one frequency present, and that frequency is a 1 Hertz sine wave. I can double my frequency, and you can see on the frequency spectrum, the spike shifts a little bit. I can also add signals together. So here I added a 1 Hertz and a 2 Hertz sine wave together. And you get this very distinct pattern that we like to call a beat pattern. It will repeat every so often, depending on the multiplicative values of the frequencies. But you can see in the Fourier after the Fourier transform is taken, I have 2 spikes. So while on the left, you might be trying to interpret that time series signal as, if you looked at it long enough, you might be able to determine it's a 1 Hertz and 2 Hertz wave. But by looking at the Fourier transform of that, the frequency domain data, it's very obvious there's exactly two peaks. I can even do things like change the amplitude of one of those peaks and it shows up. So here, all I've done is it's the same signal, but I halved the amplitude of the 2 Hertz sine wave, right? So you can see there's a little bit of change. You would have a really hard time estimating the relative amplitudes of these signals directly from the time domain data, but the frequency domain data lets you grasp that information much quicker with less analysis. And so that's why this equation is very valuable, is it lets us work specifically just with the frequencies that are relevant. I have sometimes your frequency can spread over time, and you can actually get a continuous spectrum of frequencies. So in this case, I have a sine wave where the frequency starts at 1 Hertz and grows to 4 Hertz, right? So the frequency is increasing. In the business, we call this a linearly frequency modulated waveform, or a chirp signal. You can imagine like a bird chirping outside. That's the kind of sound wave that might be produced by this kind of frequency. And what you see in the frequency domain is now you have a pretty even spread of frequencies starting at 1 and ending at 4 Hertz. It starts going to 0 after that. So immediately from this, I can say, okay, it looks like I have a relatively even spread of frequencies in this region, and they all have about the same amplitude. And this is probably the most complicated example we'll get to, but it's very relevant for understanding what the Fourier transform does. So let's apply this to EEG data. So this is real data that was gathered on SedLine displays at BMC. Particularly, this is a patient under the effects of propofol. And so on the left is the time domain data. You would have a really hard time understanding exactly what frequencies are present in that signal. It kind of looks like there's some big amplitudes in there, but what is the frequency of the small amplitudes? It's hard to tell. On the right is the Fourier transform of that signal. You can see a really big spike far to the left. Those are your theta waves, your really low frequency brain waves, think 0 to 4 Hertz. It goes down, and then it rises back up. There's a small secondary rise. That's actually the alpha brainwave frequencies, right? You're thinking like 8 to 12 Hertz for that particular hump. So we notice that there is some kind of increased activity around the alpha waves, and then it decreases again. And that's very indicative of what you would expect to be spurred by drugs like propofol or sevoflurane. To make it a little more clear, what frequencies we actually care about, we can color this data. So let's say I want to color it so I can just say all the red stuff is high power and all the blue stuff is low power. Well, that's exactly what I've done here. The colors are probably a little hard to see in the yellow, but I just took the height of every single value and I colored it based on a set of colors that we call jet colors. Like by computer scientists, they like to name all their color sets by stuff. And jet has blue being really small values and red being really high values. And this is the same color scheme that most EEG monitors use in the OR.
So your scale on the left is on decibels, or?
I've scaled this in decibels, which is a little different than like linear scale. It's like a logarithmic scale, but it's a useful value. Pretty much anyone who measures like sound, any signals after the Fourier transform, they like to work in decibels. It makes the math a little easier to do once you've done the conversion. What we can do is at one point in time, I can measure the spectrum. So I can say for the next 2 seconds, I'm going to measure the data and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to get a snapshot of what the Fourier transform was at that point in time, and I'll plot it. And then what I can do is I can wait another 2 seconds and I can get a Fourier transform of 2 more seconds of data and plot it again. So basically in time, I can slowly get snapshots of, for this 2 seconds, what did the brain waves look like for my patient? So I know this is like a GIF and so it's looping, but what's happening here is this is my single snapshot. And then in time, I'm going to plot multiple snapshots. So that's what this is. And now I'm going to color the data. So I'm going to color the high values as red and the low values as blue. And because it's colored, I can look at the data from the top down. And by looking at it from the top down, you can see in that image, some of the data is hidden behind the contour of that plot. So by viewing it from the top down, I can see everything without having to rotate it. So viewing it with color representing the third axis means you don't have to interact with the monitor to rotate things or adjust to get a better image. It lets us just have a top-down view. Think like a contour map. If you are into like hiking, you might see the contours where different colors would represent higher altitude on a hill. It's exactly the same way here. I'm using red to represent what frequencies are really high power. My x-axis is going to show how it evolved over time. And my y-axis is the frequency, what frequencies are active. So I took some real data. So this is actually data that was measured by Dr. Ortega here last year. And this is a patient experiencing propofol. So on the left here, you can see this is my 3D spectrum. If I take all the data, you notice it's a lot spikier than what I had on the last slide. There's noise in here and there's fluctuations that happen as the patient's anesthetized. But if I just simply rotate it and view it from the top down, you can see I can recreate this image on the right, which is what you would see on the monitor. That is the 2D DSA that you guys like to use. And what you can notice is on this image on the left, it's just that the high values are red and the low values are blue. So the frequencies that are red are high power and the frequencies that are blue are really low power, which means they're not really contributing to the signal. Okay, so that's how I construct the DSA. And now, yes.
Before we move on to the pharmacological. So what effect on the interpretation, if you play with a scale of the decibels, like an example is not infrequently I come into rooms and the scale has been messed with and there is a solid red band from alpha on down to delta. And there's no, like, it's just like red, like that sign B you saw. And obviously that's not probably the case. So how do you determine, because every patient, depending on their brain power, is going to be different. You have a young person versus an older person with, how do you determine visually what the right scale would be for a patient?
That's a
difficult question.
So it's a difficult question for reasons that you probably don't think.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
One of the things about working in decibel units is typically if I want to take so what I'm measuring, and let me skip forward to a few slides. Sorry, I have like lots of videos. Come on, almost there. There we go. So the way that we're actually measuring this data, right, is I'm measuring voltages. I'm measuring what is the electrical potential at one point, what is the electrical potential on another point of the patient's skull, and I'm subtracting them. This is the second equation, by the way. So I take the difference of my voltages and I compute this like delta V, the change in the voltage. And that's what's being plotted as the time series data of my frequency. If I want to take voltage and I want to convert it to power, the equation for that also requires that I know the electrical resistance of the patient's brain. As you can imagine, that's not a value that we just have like in notebooks. It's different for people, particularly it's V squared over R. So the voltage squared divided by the resistance of the patient's brain. And the reason why we work in decibels is we can do this interesting math trick that cancels the resistance out of the calculation. So really what's being plotted, it's not the power, it's directly proportional to the power. But by putting it in log space, basically I can ignore the constant. The constant comes out of the math and it falls out. So once I've gone to dB, I'm kind of in made up magic unit space. If it sounds like I'm just talking about random math tricks, it's really because I am. But essentially dB is made up magic units, and it just depends on what your reference voltage was and the resistance of the patient's brain. And so basically what I'm getting at here is that you can anticipate that you're going to have higher power in things like younger patients and lower power in things like older patients, but there's no firm conversion between decibels and raw voltage. It's really something you'll have to play with your patients. Does that make, I know that's not a satisfying answer.
I think it does. And like I was told by the massing of people, one of the massing instructors, that you basically, if you're doing propofol, you have your picture with the red on the delta and a little bit less red on the around the alpha, the 8 to 12. And basically you play to the scale until you get the pattern you would expect for the drive.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right answer. It's pretty empirical, right? Like
they told me the same thing, and I feel like you can manipulate it so that you can make it look
exactly.
Like
that's my view.
Yeah, that you can be misled.
So the real answer is it depends on the electrical resistivity of your patient's brain, which is why they're not recommending a certain value. They're just kind of letting you be like, oh, like maybe you should set it. You get pretty consistent values within a certain range, but really what we care about for like logarithmic space is not where 0 is, because I can define 0 dB to be anything. That's why the units are made up. It's really, I care about what the difference between two values are. So two values that are separated by 10 decibels, one will always be 10 times more powerful than the other. Every 10 decibels is a factor of 10. So if I'm 50 decibels down, that's 100,000 times more powerful than the low value signal. So I care about the difference, but where I define 0, it's arbitrary, and that's really up to the clinicians to make that setting. So
is it affected by the electrical resistance of the brain or everything that is outside of the brain, the skin, the bone, the dura, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, technically everything. So you can think of this as a little electrical circuit. So there's an electrical circuit running from node V0 to V sub F, and everything in between there, the skin, the bone, the brain.
If the skin is drier, how does it affect it?
It's an interesting question. I would expect water to slightly improve the electrical resistance, but I don't actually have, I didn't actually look at that.
So your decibel in elderly is because of the water content in their skin. Can it be?
I would expect that the brain is actually outputting a smaller amount of electrical power too. I would expect that would be more indicative because, basically a factor of 2, if the skin is half as conductive, that would only be a 3 decibel change. Factors of 2 wind up being 3 decibels in decibel space. So it would be a very small change. You'd have to make it 10 times, 100 times less conductive to start seeing significant changes. I expect that it's probably more related to the electrical output.
I think the machine accounts for that. When you put the pads on and it'll tell you high impedance, I was taught trick by someone when they were developing, because we did some of the work here when they were developing. And what they would do when that happened is they'll lift that particular pad of the electrode and put a little dollop of that water gel on, and then the impedance go to normal. So there is a range obviously it's gonna change some, but there is a range, I think, within which the machine considers the signals they're getting are accurate, and if it's outside that, it's gonna read high impedance.
Folks,
That's my read.
we have 20 minutes left and Jake, sorry Mauricio, and Jake has a question.
I have something to add. If you watch EEG techs do a full head with gold cup electrodes, they'll use a abrasive soap, and they'll actually exfoliate the skin and then use a hyperconductive gel to reduce the impedance. Anything below 10 kiloohms tends to work well.
Yeah, this gets complicated because in reality, it's not water, but water and electrolytes. So that calculus might be different. Here.
Right.
But anyway, go ahead, sir. And questions so that we can keep it snappy because 20 minutes left, less than 20 minutes. Any questions back there, folks? Feel free. I mean, I know this is intimidating, but feel free. Go ahead.
Yeah. We'll backtrack just a little. So I'm just gonna play two of the videos in this section. But vaguely, I did take some sound waves and convert them directly to the DSA. So what I'm actually gonna present here is like just the C scale on a piano. It's me playing on the piano, just the C scale here. And I'm just gonna plot the time domain data and the Fourier transform in this video here. So what I want you to really pull from that is as you can hear the pitches getting higher, you see on the frequency spectrum, the peak was moving more and more to the right. It indicates a higher frequency, and all of them had about the same height of peak. So they're all about the same level of power. I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm gonna add the DSA in this next video.
Then hold on for a second. And I know that we mentioned it briefly in the video, but can you clarify what we are doing because of the capability of the human ear to hear these things, right? That we are upscaling the frequencies of the EEG in order for us to actually be able to hear.
Oh yeah, I have some sonicated EEGs later on, and I will talk about that.
Good enough. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just raw sound data.
Yeah.
This is just a audio file I recorded on my cell phone. So now the bottom plot is the DSA. What you'll notice is as it's getting higher pitch, the red peaks are moving up. But the DSA holds more information because not only is it showing the Fourier transform now, but it shows the Fourier transform previously in time. So I can watch as the signal evolves in time. And that general trend in change in time is probably the most useful information to operators of the machines. You want to say, wow, the spectral edge frequency is going up a lot. Like, I wonder what's going on with my patient, right? But every patient's going to have a different baseline. So the changes and the trends are probably some of the most useful stuff. I'm going to skip. I have several songs, like 60-second values. There we go. I have some Red Hot Chili Peppers here. The slides are going to be made available for everyone, and you'll be able to watch these videos for yourself. We're going to skip that because we're already running a little behind. As I mentioned before, this is more a section about exactly what is the data meant to represent in a clinical setting now. So here I already mentioned the subtraction and the electrical potential. So we're plotting the difference. And particularly this image in the top right is probably something you've seen from the Massimo user manual. But there's five measurement points being put on the patient's head. There's a central point, which is your reference. And then all four are different subtracted values. So I have 2 for the left hemisphere and 2 for the right hemisphere of the brain. And I'm using those to construct the information for, the upper spectrogram is meant to show the left hemisphere and the lower one is meant to show the right hemisphere data. But that's what is actually being done when you attach the electrodes. So here I took the decomposition of some actual EEG signals. So on the top is a raw EEG that I captured from a patient. And then next I've done what's called bandpass filtering. I've eliminated all the frequencies that are outside of a certain frequency band. So I'm only plotting the components of that signal that are in the delta range. and the theta range, the alpha, beta, gamma. I had to scale some of the amplitudes, particularly the gamma, because the gamma in this one just looked like pretty much a flat line. It almost wasn't visible. But what you can see here is that these things all added together linearly will exactly perfectly recreate the blue signal here. So it's exactly made up of these composing frequencies. So if we go back to my data earlier with propofol, when I'm separating this out, I can look at what is my data in a specific frequency band. And I'm going to get a little closer here because I forgot my microphone is tied to it. So here I have my delta waves shown in blue. And on the DSA, this blue band is in the same frequency band. Remember, frequencies on the y-axis now. So what I'm seeing here in this blue region is exactly what is down here in my low delta waves. And that's where that dark red line is on all of your spectrograms. I'm also showing in red my alpha waves. That's exactly what's showing on. This is what you would expect for a patient of propofol. And so what you can see is it starts a little light and then the alpha waves get more active. Right here at the end, it's kind of tapering off. So it looks like the alpha waves are becoming less prominent in your signal. So there's a time evolution component. I understand the frequencies. And then based on this scale here for the colors, I can understand how powerful are these frequencies relative to each other. I also want to talk about the spectral edge frequency. So if I take the area under the Fourier transform, you guys may recognize that as like the integral under it. If I take the area under that Fourier transform, that is the total power thing. The height is the power delivered at that frequency. So integrating across all frequencies gives me the total power in my signal. And what I can do is I can say, okay, at what point have I captured almost all the power in my signal? And that point is going to be the frequency at the edge of my spectrum, the spectral edge frequency. So here I've taken this green area represents 95% of the power in my signal. This red area only represents 5% of that area. And if this dotted line separates them, this dotted line is the spectral edge frequency for that curve. It's just the line that separates the area that has most of my power from the area that has really not much power left. And by doing that, I can say, okay, at what frequency am I really getting most of my power content? Where is the edge of my frequency spectrum? So when I plot that on a DSA, what happens is over time, I can plot this white line. And at any point in time, I can say, yep, there's only 5% of the total energy up here. And 95% of it lies down here. Keep in mind that in dB, 10 dB is times 10 more powerful. So the red signal actually has a lot more power than these green hues. 100, 1,000 times more powerful.
Questions, Jan and Veronica? Comments?
Sorry, I was just confirming what power meant.
Well,
Okay.
just confirm it out loud for the audience.
Yeah, so we were just saying that the area under the curve is where most of the waves actually are. Is that correct? So
Yeah.
red, you kind of want to follow that.
Yeah, power explicitly represents the energy delivered over time. How much energy is being delivered at a certain amount of time? So in the sound analogy, it is loudness, right? There's different types of signals where it might represent different things, but the sound analogy is what I think is most intuitive. And it's just a louder signal is going to have more power. A quieter signal is going to have lower power. So I'd expect those quiet values to be in the blue hues and the red hues to be my particularly loud sections.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Why did you decide it 95 or 5, not like 8?
Yeah, in various fields, it is different values. So particularly in EEG processing, it's common to use SEF 90, which is 90 and 10%, or SEF 95, 95 and 5%. For the Masimo monitors, it's 95, but that is an arbitrary value. For example, when we measure earthquakes, we're measuring like seismographic data, we use 80, so 80-20.
Can I make a quick comment on that? Because I didn't know. Recently, I was doing a case where there was no monitoring for a case, and I couldn't do set lines, so I asked the technician for the spectral edge, and I learned that they actually set it at 85. So like she reset it at 95 to give me a number that was comparable. So that's a very important concept of which I had no idea.
Arturo.
So just in the comparison or in this kind of bring it from the sound analogy. So the sound analogy is the loudness. Is the intensity here, is it kind of, you know, effectively like the number of the population of neurons that are firing at the same frequency?
It would be the total amount of electrical energy being conveyed at that frequency range. Some of that could be the number of neurons, but certain neurons are also going to activate more powerfully. So that's not a one-to-one analogy. But vaguely, it's just how much energy is actually being conveyed across the patient's brain at that particular frequency band.
Any other questions? If not, no more? Go ahead, sir.
So this slide is kind of here just to make a small point that there are some drawbacks to use of the EEG data, but the EEG is like a direct measurement of the patient's brain state. So obviously the goal here is to try and draw a connection between what is on the screen to actual patient biology, and then the patient biology should inform your decisions. So this is kind of a closed loop that we'll be working with. Now I want to show some actual data. Some notes on all the videos of this section. I have a few different drugs and physical effects that are here. And all of these have been sped up by a factor of 75 just to move them into the range of human hearing, right? So human hearing doesn't even start until the high gamma wave frequency. So if I just took the exact data, it'd be hard to tell. So these are sped up by a factor of 75 to just make them a little higher pitch and put them into the audible range of human hearing. First, I have some propofol data. Kind of sounds like someone blowing on a microphone, right? There's a low hum of air constantly blowing in. I'll close that there. I also have sevoflurane. Sevoflurane has a little bit more power and lower frequencies, so you're going to hear like the low frequencies be more active in this signal. It'll come in a second.
Sorry, did you switch from propofol to sevoflurane?
Yeah, that was sevoflurane.
But you had it switched.
Oh, I think that might have been at the start of the case before the sevoflurane started
Awake to sevoflurane?
It was probably induction with propofol, and then they turned on the sevoflurane. So that's why yeah.
Let's see. I do have some data that shows burst suppression. So what you're going to notice at some point, the signal is just going to completely cut off, which shows like isoelectric activity in the brain. That's what a burst sounds like. It sounds like nothing. That section of just saying no data, it's because there's really nothing powerful enough to measure on the monitors. That's what isoelectric activity sounds like. This unzipping structure, so you guys may note at the end of a case where you're using propofol, there's this structure that's kind of just called unzipping, where the alpha frequencies kind of move up towards the beta range, and they get higher frequency as the patient's coming out of their anesthetized state. And you'll be able to hear the frequencies go up right here for this data. Right, so it gets a little higher frequency before tapering off to nothing. And that's what like the end of propofol induction sounds like. Yes?
What is the sound frequencies you converted the EEG to?
You're asking the sound frequencies? So this is the raw EEG data, just times 75 frequency. So everything has a factor of 75 times more higher pitch.
I'm thinking of the audible sound range for ears is 80 to 280 hertz or something, right? So you are probably on the lower range there. Why not using a higher pitch?
Because of like some of the frame rate concerns, basically the next step up I could go up was to 150 times, which started being really
Guys,
high
guys,
frequency.
Hold your comment so that we can all.
But yeah,
learn.
it was an arbitrarily chosen value. I could speed it up to anything if I wanted, but yeah, I just chose 75 because it seemed to put most of the frequencies in a pretty reasonable around 1,000 hertz band at most.
Yeah, there's a comment, but in the middle of the room.
Yes.
Sorry, I just want to know, to mention something about the PSI, like what does that index represent? What is the algorithm of it that is possible?
Yeah, so
Some of us use it.
you're
Similar to the BIS.
Mhm. You're asking about the patient spectral index. So the PSI, so first of all, that's a proprietary algorithm they use to compute the PSI. So I don't know everything about that equation. I have to work at Massimo and I'd probably be under like an NDA if you had asked that question. I do know certain values that they have published that they say go into it. Probably the most important value in the PSI is the spectral edge frequency. They're trying to compute the spectral edge frequency. That's why in cases where they're saying it's unreliable, like ketamine or nitrous oxide, where you get high gamma wave activity, the spectral edge frequency is going to increase, and that's going to artificially increase your PSI, even though the patient's not actually anesthetized. There is a decay equation that they did publish about detecting burst suppression. So they have a running probability. The machine's trying to estimate how probable is it that the patient's under burst or about to burst. And it uses that probability as a weight factor in the equation as well. So those are some of the things that it's trying to measure. Yeah.
I think the other thing is that the PSI only gets updated, I think, every 45 seconds or every minute. So if you induce and you look at the PSI, we'll often say like 90, even though the patient's anesthetized, whereas the DSA is like every 2 seconds.
Every 3 seconds.
The DSA is updated every 2.5 seconds.
The PSI best case scenario. The PSI best case scenario is updated every 45 seconds. In stable state, so during emergence, during infusion, unstable state, sorry, when things are changing rapidly, it'll refresh every 3 minutes. So like talking to Massimo people, maybe spectral edge is better at times of rapid changes if you're following an index, but during steady state, you should have the PSI is more reliable. They were trying, actually, they don't have the spectral edges in the PSI because they reached out to us to see if we could be a site for their next work on the algorithm. They're trying to, maybe the spectral edges in there, but they want to incorporate the spectral edges in a more prominent way into the PSI. And we don't know what it is.
Okay.
It's a proprietary thing, but.
In the current documentation they have online, they say it's at least used, but they don't state how.
So yeah, he didn't, Dr. Bada didn't say how or how much, but he said, hey, would you guys be interested in being a site for?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, folks,
We'll invite you.
we're out of time. Let's give him one round of applause.
Yeah.
You can stick around. You have some time to stick around.
Yeah, I have actually about 2 hours.
Yeah, Daniel Vickers, stick around. We'll do it again.
So much bias, especially.
I actually can follow that.